So I'm Heidi Emberling, and I have 2 kids in the district. I have a 6th grade son at Terman and a 4th grade daughter at Juana Briones. And I've been very involved in the schools since they started. I was PTA president and co-president and site council chair at Briones, and then I moved into more of a district role, joining the PI board for 2 years, Partners in Education, our education foundation, and then I've been on the Project Safety Net Collaborative for the past year, both as my role as an educator from Parents Place and as a concerned parent. So I very much enjoy the collaborative process. I've enjoyed working with all of these groups on the ground level. I started to get more involved in district work and started attending school board meetings about 2 years ago. More regularly. I had attended them in the past when big issues came up, like everyday math, and everyone said to me as PTA co-president, "What's going on with this?" And I said, "I don't know, I guess I better go to a meeting." That was when my son was in 1st grade, so that was a long time ago. Education is not just a passion of mine, it's also my profession. I'm an educator, child development specialist at Parents Place. I support families and children. I'm a teacher trainer for early childhood professionals, so I do a lot of workshops on every topic related to child development, including a lot of on-brain development, which better informs teachers in the classroom with curriculum, and it helps parents become the best parents they can be. Let's see, what else can I say about that? Oh, the big issue that I have in the district, and what I'd really like to work on, is to ensure that every student feels a positive connection to school, whether they're elementary, middle, or high school, and that they feel connected to a trusted adult on campus, whether that's a teacher, a counselor, a coach, a classroom aide, the learning specialist, either way, that there's a connection that they feel to school and to adults on school. We do a lot of work with that, with Project Safety Net, and trying to figure out how to connect high school students, because our high schools are large institutions, so keeping things smaller, making sure that there's access to adults on campus, that you can build relationships over time. That's really, really important. And social emotional health of our students is equally as important as our academic achievement. So I want to make sure that everyone graduates ready to be successful personally, academically, and professionally.
Great. As someone who has obviously observed a lot of school board meetings without having to be up there on the dais actually participating, I wonder what you've concluded as to how you will best make a contribution on the board if you're elected, and also what your assessment is about the functioning of the board currently.
I'm very committed to an open and transparent process that honors the public trust. I think we need more clarity of vision and clarity of goals with each item that comes up. The issues that become controversial in our district tend to come out of confusion or not understanding what the goal is of this issue or this agenda item. This happened recently with the calendar. There were not clear goals laid out as to why we're moving the calendar. So there was a lot of confusion in the parent community. We have to remember that parents and teachers are partners in the district, and their voices need to be included as we move along in this process. There needs to be, and what I would do is set up a web page on the PAUSD website dedicated to an issue that comes up that's going to affect everyone in the community. So the calendar should get a web page. It should say, this is why we're doing it. These are the 3 goals. Is it alleviating student stress? Is it because of the uneven semesters? Is it something that the teachers wanted as far as the union contract negotiations? Because calendar is part of the union contract negotiations. Is it that we don't want homework over winter break? What are our goals? And then what's the research behind it? Why does moving this a week earlier address those issues? How does it address it? And then what are the metrics? How are we going to measure whether this was a successful strategy or not? We did a survey in March of last year. We're hopefully going to do a survey in January, although I haven't heard anything about it yet, to see how this fall went. This was the first fall in the new calendar, so let's figure out how it went, and then let's look at it next fall and see if it's made a difference or not.
Before we leave the calendar, let's just
Sure.
get sort of that topic out of the
Absolutely.
way. Did you support the change in the calendar ultimately, or what was your view on it?
I think I was unclear as to why we were moving the calendar still at the end of the long conversations. We spent 5 meetings talking about the calendar, and we only have 18 or 19 in a year. So spending 5 of them on the calendar issue, and then at the end of the first meeting, they had talked about moving forward with the change, and then at the end of the 5th meeting, they voted to move forward with the change. So I'm not sure the 5 meetings and the hundreds of hours and the hundreds of emails that came through, I'm not sure the community feels like the conversation was directed in any way or that it was clear where we were going. So again, it does come back to that process issue. I would like to see the results of the survey this January. I mean, it's happened now. Is this a calendar we want to stick with? I think is the decision facing the board now.
So returning to the process question,
Yes.
whose responsibility is that to ensure clarity of,
It's the
of
board's.
proposals and clarity of decision making?
The board's responsibility. The board has to be clear in their vision and their goals and where they're going, or the superintendent and staff can't implement. Right? The board sets policy and the superintendent and staff implement policy. So if we don't have a clear policy, then the implementation is going to be unclear as well.
So the second part of my question was to assess the way the board actually functions. So where is the breakdown? You've got 5 board members all who want to do the right thing and to be clear in what they want in terms of policy. So how will you make a difference, and where is the breakdown currently?
I think you have to ask for clear guidance from the staff as far as why do they want to make this change. The superintendent came to the board and said, this is a change I think we should make, after having met with the teachers union and that sort of thing. So the board needs to ask those specific questions and say, please come back to us with the 3 goals, what's the problem statement here? What are we addressing with this? And how are we going to measure whether we do this? I think the board has to insist on a clarity of how this implementation is going to go and why are we moving in this direction? And the research, the board does not have a designated staff person to do research for them. The city council has more resources than the school board does. But the school board has to decide if this is a priority in our community, then we need to direct staff time towards this.
So how would you draw the distinctions between the role of the school board versus the role of the superintendent and his cabinet and the role of individual teacher groups at various schools? Mm-hmm. Who's making what decisions in your view of the ideal governance model?
So the board, as I mentioned before, the board sets policy and then the superintendent and staff implements that policy. But the superintendent that we have now is a strong superintendent. If he brings an idea to the board that we want to analyze and think about setting a policy around, that's okay too. There is sort of a healthy tension between what the board is bringing forth and what the superintendent is bringing forth, and it's a question of priorities and resources. Where do we want the staff spending their time? The teachers have to be brought in when it's something that's affecting the classroom and something that's affecting curriculum and something that's affecting students. I like decisions to be made as close to the student as possible, and the teachers are our best resource as far as that goes. So if we need to be informed about a topic that's going to affect students on that level, then we need to bring in teacher input.
You said 2 different things there. You said you want the decisions made as close to the students as possible, which would suggest teachers and principals, and then you said you want their input. So to me, that's exactly the ambiguity that exists today. To what extent, when we talk about buy-in of teachers, and you hear that term a lot, that we can't do anything without the buy-in of teachers, how do you articulate when teachers get to make decisions in this district and when the policy is implemented by the school board?
There's a tension in our district between district-made decision-making and site-based decision-making. So let's take another controversial issue of guidance and counseling to look at this question. The school board sets a policy, let's say, that we want to increase student connectedness on campus by 20%. The California Healthy Kids Survey, we want to see the student connectedness questions rise by 20% as far as how they feel connected on campus. Come back to us with how you're going to implement that. So then the superintendent and the staff say, okay, this is sort of how we feel like we can do it. Now, we have two totally different guidance systems at our high schools when it comes to academic guidance. We have social emotional guidance counselors at both schools. We have career and college counselors at both, and we have academic advisory systems that are different. There's a larger question here of centralized process. How do you ensure comparable educational experiences if you have two totally different models? How are you going to assess that as a district level if the models of delivery are so different? It's very hard to do. What the superintendent did last year and the board is hired a consultant to do a strengths and weaknesses SWOT analysis at both schools of their individual sites. And it came back about 50-50 of satisfaction, dissatisfaction, if you look at those numbers. Well, that's not good enough for me. A 50-50 means that 50% of the students are not satisfied with their connectedness on campus, that are not satisfied with the guidance that they're getting, which means this is an opportunity for us to look forward and say, how do we want to progress in a way that gives kids a comparable educational experience and in a way that we can assess it? Because how do we assess it if the two models are so different? So here's the problem statement. Let's come together now and get teacher feedback. What do you like about the program you're using now? What do you not? And can you go and look at each other's models? See what you can learn from that. I don't think the gun teachers have had a chance yet to go observe the advisory models. I was interviewed by journalism students at Palo a few weeks ago, and I asked them about the TA advisory program. And they have varying degrees of satisfaction just in the conversation we had there. So I think if the numbers are showing now that it's 50-50 at both sides, that's just not acceptable in Palo Alto. We've got to figure out a way that we're reaching all students.
To parse that a bit,
Sure.
though, what I'm really getting at in the question is whether we ought to be making decisions based on a best practices model that goes through the process that you're describing and arrives through the school board with a decision as to what is the best, in this example you're giving,
Sure.
what is the best practices for high school counseling in a modern progressive school district.
Which absolutely needs to be part of that discussion.
Model. Now, this school board has taken the view, and I think that you're saying you agree with it, that the policy decision is a very broad policy of ensuring similar outcomes and equitable programs. And beyond that, it's up to the school sites. That automatically does not lead to a unified best practices approach to any policy matter, and it makes the school board not really accountable for the ultimate program that's implemented. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, so
Sure,
can
yeah.
you react to that?
Yeah, sure. I don't see it that way. I see it as an inclusive collaborative process where you're, we've hired the best and the brightest here in Palo Alto. We make an effort to hire great teachers. We make an effort to hire great counselors. So I want to hear what they have to say. They're on the ground level. I'm not. They're in, the counselors are with the students. The teachers are with the students. They know what's going on the ground level. So their voice is very important to consider. I'm not saying as a board that if the research was presented that said, nationwide everybody's moving towards an advisory model, there are weaknesses to the model that we can improve upon, but we feel like we need to move in that direction. I'm not saying the school board, then the school board set a policy, yes, we want one comparable educational experience, one model to serve both schools. Let's put the best minds together and figure out what that model is. I'm not saying
But
that
should
that
the
would.
goal be for things like high school counseling or bullying programs or any number of other programs, should the goal be to identify a best practices model and implement it throughout our school district?
With the bullying prevention program, that's absolutely clear. And that came, interestingly, from a site-based change. So one site adopted one of the newer, more evidence-based models of bullying prevention. Another site then decided to adopt that same one as the principals actually moved. The principal from the first school moved to a second school and brought it to that school as well. Now there's one of the more current, recent evidence-based bullying prevention programs in 5 of our 12 elementary schools. However, the other ones have not come on board yet. So I actually mentioned at the forum last night that I think the district should take a look at those best practices. It came from a site-based decision, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't share best practices across the district.
Well, and I'm trying to broaden this to a general
Exactly.
philosophy here. Should that be the way this district operates, that it formulates a best practice with regards to any number of programs and implements it even if the school site prefers to do something else? The principal's got another way of doing that program.
Yes. For the short answer to that question.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think, again, there are ways in which things come out of the sites, like you mentioned, where they're trying something and it turns out that it's working and it is an accepted best practice and there is a lot of evidence around this program, and that needs to be brought to the district level and a policy needs to be formed around that.
Do you think best practices philosophy would apply to all types of programs? Do you think there's some things that the sites really can just decide on their own, from what you've seen as a parent and a parent educator?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nice to have some flexibility with the site funds. You know, there's a site council at every school site, and they decide how best to use those funds at that school. And so I think that is appropriate for that school. There is, in our community, we've decided to have an educational equity model, for example, with our PI funding. So that's split evenly among all the schools based on enrollment. So every individual student benefits from that. I think a model like that may need to be adopted through the PTAs as well. We'll have to see if that steps up to be a best practice, for example.
So as you know, just to wrap up this
Sure.
site-based decision-making philosophy, as you know, Barbara Klausner chose not to seek re-election.
Right.
And in her statement, she basically said the reason was she came to this board with the expectation that the board, through its actions, could implement certain things throughout the district of an educational program nature. And what she learned after 4 years was that the culture of site-based decision-making and deference to the superintendent and his staff was so powerful, so strong, that it rendered her experience on the board unsatisfactory. I mean, it was not what she was envisioning. You now have stated a similar view to hers in terms of why she wanted to be on the school board in the first place. Have you given thought to the comments that she made? And
Sure.
What makes you think that the system and the culture can be changed?
I think you have to navigate these the history of Palo Alto and the way that things have been working at from a fresh perspective now, because every principal in our district has changed over in the last 4 years. So every single leader in our district has moved. So they're all new to their school or new to the district, or some are from the district but are in a new place with a new community. And I think Kevin Skilly encouraged that, move around, keep it fresh, share best practices, right? Like we were talking about the bullying prevention program that went from one school to a second school because the principal changed. So I think there is a real opportunity now to talk about things from a more standardized point of view or from a more district level point of view. The beauty of our district is that it's one of the few unified districts in this area. We're a K-12 unified district. We have the ability to affect student success from kindergarten through 12th grade. We have a great opportunity to put in programs that will benefit students all along. There's no reason that we can't do that. I do think there's a method that goes with that, and having served on a lot of nonprofit boards, the big ship moves slowly, and I understand that. I do think, and I don't consider it as looking for buy-in, I consider it as eliciting specialized professional input. I respect our teachers. I want to hear what they have to say. I respect our principals. I want to hear what they have to say. I think when you provide very smart people with the ability to work together and come together towards a common goal, you can make things happen.
On the counseling issue, Barbara Klausner, as you probably heard when you were there, took the superintendent to task basically for what she believed was a failure of governance, of the governance process, where in her view, the superintendent had miscommunicated to the gun staff what the opinion and direction of the school board was. Do you agree with her comments regarding that issue?
I think it was unfortunate how that conversation went. And I think it was unfortunate.
Which conversation? Do you mean her
The conversation
statement or
in
the
our
whole-
community around guidance. Because instead of a process in which, because counseling was a focus goal for the year from the school board. And unfortunately, it turned into somewhat of a divisive issue, where it turned into one school is not getting a comparable educational experience than the other. The outside consultant was brought in to do a SWOT analysis of each individual school and was not asked to compare them. So that was another mistake as far as I'm concerned. We have two distinct models. The conversation was around which one better reflects best practices around the nation, and she was asked specifically not to compare them. Then she came and presented her report to the school board meeting, which again was kind of a 50-50, how can we improve both systems kind of thing. The data was then manipulated to turn into something that made it seem that it was 80-20. She then said at the meeting, I'm very uncomfortable with my data being used in this way because that's not what you asked me to do. You asked me not to compare them specifically, and now you're comparing them and you're trying to make a decision based on something that you asked me not to do. So I'm uncomfortable with you using my data in that way. The teachers then heard from the board, we want to implement advisory gun, we want to implement it by the fall. And a lot of them said, what is going on here? We haven't even been included in these conversations. What's going on? Are we being asked to now teach something that was not in our job description? And when you don't have, you haven't consulted your community and the people that work with students on that level, all of a sudden now you have a fight. Now you have a cat backed into a corner saying, don't tell me what to do. You hired me for my ideas and my contributions, and now you're telling me to do something that I haven't even begun to think about. And so I think what happened with that conversation is that Kevin Skelly then did a memo saying, look, we have to start this conversation, and he tried to slow down the process and talk with the board, and then the board was saying, look, that's not what we told you to do. We told you that we want to implement advisory. So,
but that's not what, the board never instructed him to implement advisory.
not to implement advisory, but that they wanted a presentation to come back on how we could implement an advisory program at Gunn.
The board's input was simply that they wanted to make sure that advisory was one of the alternatives looked at by the Gunn staff. And I think what Klausner's statement was referencing was the communication, the translation of what the board was saying and what the gun community was told about what the board was saying by the superintendent.
Right.
And assuming you've read all that, I'd like to know whether you felt where the responsibility lies here for that, for what you just described.
There was absolutely a communication breakdown. And that was unfortunate because it caused a lot of drama.
Mm-hmm. So you would,
Again, going back to the point that these discussions need to be much more open and transparent. If we're going to talk about an advisory model at Gunn, or if we're going to talk about a third model, a homeroom model, how are we going to approach this? Then let's put up a web page on our website. Let's talk about guidance and advisory. Let's put it, what are the goals here? Is it increasing student connectedness? Why are we going through all this trauma? 50-50. Satisfaction, dissatisfaction, we're just not happy with that. Okay, put that up there. How are we going to improve it? How are we going to assess it? What are the metrics? What's the research? Let's be open and transparent. I think this comes from my journalism background, but I'm all about that. Let the community have a say. We have a very active, strong parent community here, of which I am a big part. Include the parents in the conversation, include the teachers in the conversation. When it's calendar, it's going to affect parents. When it's guidance and counseling, it's going to affect the teachers, certainly, if they want them to sign up for a slot to become an advisor.
we have sort of a little mini dust-up going on right now that deals with this sort of same set of issues having to do with Schoology or
Schoology, yeah.
Schoology,
Yes.
and the way in which we would like teachers to communicate with their students and ultimately potentially parents. And there appears to be resistance in some quarters and embracing of this in others.
Webpage.
How would, huh?
Webpage, Schoology. What is it? First of all, a lot of parents don't have any idea what you're talking about. I'm a Terman parent, having come from one of Rionis and Terman. I've never heard of Schoology before I got involved in the board. Terman doesn't use Schoology as far as I know, although I did see a link to it on the Terman website the other day, and I thought, oh, what's this? Infinite Campus is also thrown around. If you're at JLS, you know about Schoology.
But isn't this an example of where the school district, somebody at the school district decides this is a great program, they've paid for it, and then they just put it out there with, use this if you want to.
So are we using that?
You've got a principal at Palo Alto High School that thinks it's great and is saying his teachers think it's great and it'll be fully implemented this year.
Right.
And then you've got people in other schools that don't even know what it is,
Right.
have no interest in turning upside down what they're now doing.
Right.
How should district policy like this, or is this a matter of district policy?
So technology is a tool. It's not a panacea for solving student problems. It's one element in an overall plan. Can we use a school as a laboratory for figuring out, does this work for the school site? And then can we spread it across the district? Is that wiser than making a board decision that we're going to implement it, spend a whole lot of money on some new technology that we don't know if it's successful or not? And then what is it that makes it successful at JLS? What is it that makes it successful at Pali? Well, you said yourself, it's the principal that's leading it, right? And I'll tell you, it's Sharon at JLS, the principal, who's leading it there. They believe in it. They have gotten their teachers involved in it. They've said a lot to their parents about it. They have the whole community on board with understanding what it is and why it is that they're doing that. So yeah, you can use that as a lab school and figure it out. We have the three principals at the middle schools work very closely together. They started one of these transition programs you mentioned earlier. The JLS program came first, the Terman Tigers. Now we have the Jordan Jaguars. So there is now a best practice for the secondary school transition from 5th to 6th grade that is now across all three schools. So that organic way certainly can come from the school sites. This Schoology is the same thing. I was at a Challenge Success Symposium on Friday at Stanford, and they were talking about a technology tool like this, which they called Parent Snoop, but they were calling it, they were talking about the dark side of these programs where kids who are grade obsessed already are starting to check their grades 2-3 times a day to see if the latest test has been posted, the latest paper has been graded, and then they're comparing it. And in our community, we have to be wary about this sort of thing. And I do think there needs to be a lot more parent education around this sort of tool. How are you using it? What does it mean? What does one bad test score mean in the larger scheme of the school year? When you just throw a technology program like this and tout its wonders, you have to prepare parents for what could be the downsides of this and how we're going to use it in the most successful way possible. You have to think about the student and what that reaction is going to be.